It stood as the laughingstock of Bitterroot Valley, a shiny corrugated steel tube shoved haphazardly inside a rotting wooden barn. They called it the City Girl's Tin Can. But when the deadliest bomb cyclone of the decade swallowed the mountains, that mocked and ridiculed metal shell became the only difference between life and a frozen death. Abigail Preston didn't move to Montana to make friends. She moved there to disappear. At 42, fresh out of a brutal divorce from a Chicago corporate lawyer named Richard Sterling, who had systematically stripped her of her confidence and half her life savings, Abby just wanted silence. She took what little money she had left and bought a foreclosed 10-acre slice of heaven in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. The property was stunning, but the infrastructure was a disaster. The centerpiece of the farm was a sprawling 1920s timber frame barn. It was a majestic cathedral of wood, but time and neglect had been cruel. The roof sagged like a tired spine, the siding had gaps wide enough to pass a dinner plate through, and the foundation was questionable at best. Abby wasn't alone. She had brought with her the only living creature that still looked at her with unconditional trust. Midnight Tempest, a 15-year-old rescue thoroughbred mare. Tempest was not only blind in one eye, but she was also heavily pregnant. A high-risk surprise Abby had discovered only after finalizing the rescue adoption. The foal was due in late December, right in the teeth of the Montana winter. By mid-September, the nights were already growing sharp. Abby had brought 3 different contractors out to look at the barn. The lowest estimate to stabilize the structure, fix the roof, and insulate a foaling stall was $45,000. Abby had exactly $6,200 in her bank account. Desperation breeds innovation, but in a small agricultural town, innovation is often mistaken for idiocy. Abby spent nights scouring the internet for cheap, durable housing solutions. She couldn't afford to fix the wooden behemoth, but she needed a climate-controlled, impenetrable safe haven for Tempest to give birth. That's when she found it on Craigslist, a disassembled, surplus military-grade Quonset hut. It was 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, made of 18-gauge corrugated galvanized steel. A local doomsday prepper had bought it years ago, never poured the concrete slab, and was selling the entire kit for $3,000. Abby bought it the next morning. Her plan was unorthodox. She couldn't pour a concrete foundation outside before the ground froze, and an exterior build would require county permits she couldn't afford and didn't have time for. Instead, she decided to build the Quonset hut inside the center aisle of the massive, drafty wooden barn. It would be a building within a building, a highly insulated, wind-proof microclimate shielded from the heavy snow loads by the outer barn's roof, even if that roof was failing. For 3 weeks, Abby worked until her hands bled. She leveled the dirt floor of the center aisle, laid down a thick vapor barrier, and started bolting the heavy steel arches together. It was grueling, bone-crushing work for one person. She had to rig a pulley system to the old barn rafters just to hoist the steel panels into place, driving hundreds of bolts through the overlapping corrugated metal. That was when Tom Henderson showed up. Tom owned the sprawling, pristine, 500-acre cattle ranch next door. He was a 4th-generation Montanan who viewed outsiders, especially single women from the city, with a mixture of amusement and disdain. He had driven his heavy-duty pickup over, ostensibly to welcome her to the valley, but mostly to snoop. When Tom walked into the dim light of the old barn and saw Abby wrestling with a shiny, semicircular steel arch, he stopped dead in his tracks. "What in God's name are you doing?" Tom asked, a slow, patronizing grin spreading across his face. Abby wiped the grease and sweat from her forehead. "I'm building an insulated foaling stall for my mare." Tom looked at the wooden barn around them, then at the steel structure. He let out a booming, chest-deep laugh that echoed off the rafters. "Honey, you're building a submarine inside a sinking ship. You know that steel is going to turn into an icebox, right? And when this old wooden roof caves in from the snow, it's going to crush your little tin can flat." "The arches are rated for hurricane winds and heavy loads," Abby said defensively, her voice tight. "And I'm spraying it with closed-cell polyurethane foam. It'll hold heat." Tom shook his head, still chuckling. "You city women. You try to outsmart nature instead of working with it. That thing is a joke. But hey, good luck. Let me know when you need me to bring the tractor over to dig you out." By the end of the week, Abby was the prime source of entertainment at Hank's Feed and Seed in town. Tom had told everyone about the tin can inside a wooden box. When Abby walked into the store to buy rubber stall mats and heavy-duty water heaters, conversations abruptly stopped. Men in worn Carhartt jackets smirked at her. "Hey, Abby," Hank called out from behind the register, a sympathetic but mocking tone in his voice. "Heard you're building a bomb shelter. You expecting the Russians or a snowstorm?" Laughter erupted near the fertilizer pallets. Abby felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. It was exactly like being married to Richard all over again, a room full of men telling her she was foolish, incompetent, and out of her depth. She paid for her supplies, lifted her chin, and walked out without a word. Let them laugh. They didn't know the fear that kept her awake at night, listening to Tempest's heavy breathing, terrified that she would fail the only creature depending on her. She returned to the farm, mixed the toxic-smelling spray foam, and began coating the inside of the steel arches, sealing every gap, every bolt, turning the metal cavern into an airtight cocoon. November swept into the valley not with a whisper, but with a roar. The temperatures dropped drastically, hovering in the low 20s. The wind whipped through the Bitterroot Valley, finding every crack and crevice in Abby's old timber barn. Standing in the outer aisles, the wind howled a mournful, shrieking tune, and the ancient wood groaned under the pressure. But inside the Quonset hut, the world was entirely different. Abby had capped both ends of the steel tunnel with framed, insulated walls and heavy sliding barn doors. She had installed a small, EPA-certified Vogelzang Defender wood stove near the entrance, piping the double-wall chimney out through a custom-cut hole, extending it safely past the old barn's roofline. The floor was layered with crushed gravel, thick rubber mats, and a foot of fresh, sweet-smelling pine shavings. When she fired up the stove, the thick layer of polyurethane foam trapped the heat instantly. While the outside thermometer read 18 degrees Fahrenheit, inside the steel cocoon, it was a balmy 62 degrees Fahrenheit. It was quiet, too. The rounded steel deflected the wind drafts that tore through the outer barn, creating a pocket of absolute stillness. Tempest loved it. The anxious mare, whose joints ached in the cold, would stand directly beneath the heat radiating from the roof, her eyes half closed in contentment. Dr. Sam Reynolds, the local equine vet, drove out on December 10th for Tempest's final checkup. Sam was a pragmatist, an older man with kind eyes but a realistic view of mortality. He ducked through the heavy sliding door of the Quonset hut and paused, visibly taken aback by the wave of warmth. "Well," Sam admitted, pulling off his gloves, "I heard the talk in town, Abby, but I have to say, it's toasty in here." "But?" Abby asked, catching the hesitation in his voice. Sam sighed, walking over to examine the massive bulge of Tempest's belly. "She's older, Abby, and she's carrying low. I'm worried about dystocia, a difficult birth. If she goes into labor and things go sideways, she's going to need a lot of medical intervention. And worse, if a foal drops into freezing temperatures, their wet coats freeze instantly. They go into hypothermic shock. This heater is great for a normal night, but—" He looked at her grimly. The National Weather Service just issued an alert. A polar vortex is detaching and plunging south, right as a low-pressure system is pulling massive moisture from the Pacific. They're calling it a generational bomb cyclone. We could see temperatures hit 30 below zero, with wind chills near -60. The power grid will fail. It always does. This little stove won't be enough if the outer barn collapses and takes out your chimney. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in Abby's stomach. "When is it hitting?" 4 days, Sam said softly. "You might want to consider moving her to Tom Henderson's commercial facility. He's got a heated foaling barn with a backup generator." The thought of going to Tom, begging for help after he had publicly humiliated her, made Abby physically nauseous. But she would do it for Tempest. The next day, she swallowed her pride and drove to Tom's sprawling ranch. She found him in his state-of-the-art, $100,000 barn, showing off his setup to a few other local ranchers. When Abby asked if she could rent a stall for the week of the storm, Tom smiled a slow, cruel smile. "Sorry, Abby," Tom said loudly, making sure the other men heard. "My stalls are full up with my own stock. Besides, I thought you had your own little bunker. What happened? Did the tin can spring a leak?" The men chuckled. Abby's jaw tightened. "Tom, my mare is high risk. If the power goes out, my 50-kilowatt diesel generator kicks in," Tom interrupted, patting the wall of his barn. "That's how you build a barn, Abby. Not with scrap metal and duct tape. You should head back and pack a bag. When that old timber roof of yours comes down, I don't want to have to dig your body out of the wreckage." Abby drove home with tears of rage and terror stinging her eyes. She was entirely on her own. By December 14th, the sky over the Bitterroot Mountains turned the color of a bruised plum. The air pressure dropped so fast, 24 millibars in a matter of hours, that Abby's ears popped just walking across the yard. The birds had completely vanished. The silence outside was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on the valley. Then, the wind arrived. It didn't start with snow. It started with an invisible, violent wall of air. Gusts exceeding 80 miles per hour slammed into the valley. Through the windows of her farmhouse, Abby watched a 100-year-old oak tree snap in half as if it were a dry twig. The temperature plummeted with terrifying speed, from 32 degrees Fahrenheit down to -15 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 4 hours. At 6 p.m., the lights in the farmhouse flickered, buzzed aggressively, and died. The valley plunged into darkness. Abby had already relocated to the Quonset hut hours earlier, knowing she couldn't risk being separated from Tempest. She had brought a cot, a battery-powered lantern, thermoses of hot coffee, and a mountain of firewood. Inside the hut, the fire crackled cheerfully. But outside the steel walls, the old timber barn was fighting for its life. The howling of the wind through the outer structure was deafening, a high-pitched scream accompanied by the terrifying crack groan of ancient wooden beams flexing past their limits. Abby sat on her cot, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, watching the steel ceiling above her. "Please hold," she prayed silently. "Please, just hold." Around 11 p.m., the snow began, a blinding, horizontal sheet of ice that piled up against the outer barn at a rate of inches per hour. Suddenly, Tempest let out a sharp, distressed whinny. The mare began pacing frantically within the confines of the rubber-matted floor, kicking at her own belly. She was sweating profusely despite the ambient temperature. Abby's heart leaped into her throat. She looked at her watch. It was 3 weeks too early. The stress of the barometric pressure drop had triggered it. Tempest was going into labor. Abby threw off her blanket and rushed to the mare's side, talking in low, soothing tones. "Okay, girl. Okay, I'm right here. Easy now." Just as Tempest went down onto the shavings, letting out a deep groan as a massive contraction hit, an ear-splitting crack echoed like a cannon shot from the darkness above them. The outer barn roof was failing. The sound was not a simple breaking of wood. It was the catastrophic, concussive roar of an implosion. Above the steel ceiling of Abby's makeshift bunker, the 1920s timber roof of the massive barn finally surrendered to the bomb cyclone. Thousands of pounds of snow, ice, and century-old Douglas fir beams came crashing down in a violent cascade. The shockwave hit the Quonset hut like a physical blow. The heavy 18-gauge galvanized steel shrieked, a deafening metallic groan that vibrated through the soles of Abby's boots. Dust and debris rained down from the edges of the sliding doors, but Abby didn't look away from the ceiling. She held her breath, her nails digging into the palms of her hands. The steel arches bowed inward under the tremendous kinetic impact, deflecting perhaps 2 or 3 inches. And then, with a resilient shudder, they locked into place. The semicircular engineering did exactly what it was designed to do. It distributed the crushing, localized weight down the curved walls and directly into the earth. The tin can held. But the victory lasted only a fraction of a second. A sharp, metallic tearing sound echoed from the far end of the hut, followed immediately by a violent backdraft. The falling timber had sheared the Vogelzang defender's double-wall chimney pipe clean off the roof. Within seconds, thick, acrid wood smoke began pouring backward through the stove's vents, filling the airtight cabin with a blinding, toxic cloud. Tempest, already deep in the agonizing throes of a contraction, threw her head back and panicked. She thrashed wildly against the pine shavings, her hooves striking the rubber mats with sickening force. "No, no, no!" Abby coughed, her eyes instantly watering as the carbon monoxide alarm on the wall began to shriek its piercing, high-pitched warning. She had a terrible choice to make. If she opened the sliding doors, the -30°F wind chill would instantly freeze the damp, struggling mare and the unborn foal. If she left the doors closed, they would all suffocate in minutes. Abby grabbed the heavy canvas water bucket she kept by the door, yanked the cast-iron latch of the wood stove open, and dumped 3 gallons of near-freezing water directly onto the glowing embers. Steam and wet ash exploded outward, coating her face in grey soot. But the fire died instantly. She cracked the sliding barn door just 3 inches, enough to let the howling, sub-zero wind act as a vacuum, sucking the smoke out into the blizzard. The temperature inside the hut plummeted immediately. The balmy 62°F dropped to 40°F, then 30°F, then hovered precariously in the low 20s as Abby wrestled the heavy door shut again and sealed the gap with a rolled-up blanket. Without the stove, they were entirely at the mercy of the elements. The only heat source left was the latent ambient temperature trapped by the thick layer of polyurethane spray foam and the radiating body heat of the 1,200-pound mare. Abby dropped to her knees in the pine shavings beside Tempest. The mare was exhausted, her coat slick with freezing sweat. Her breathing was ragged, blowing clouds of steam into the chilled air. "I've got you, girl. I've got you," Abby murmured, stripping off her heavy Carhartt jacket to free her arms, despite the biting cold sinking into her bones. She examined the mare. Dr. Sam Reynolds's worst fear was manifesting. Tempest was pushing with everything she had, but the presentation was wrong. In a normal equine birth, the foal's 2 front hooves appear first, pointing downward, followed by the nose. Abby saw only 1 hoof. The foal's right shoulder was locked behind the mare's pelvic bone. It was a classic dystocia. Without immediate intervention, the foal would suffocate in the birth canal, and the mare would tear internally and bleed to death. With the cell towers down and the roads impassable, there was no Dr. Reynolds to call. There was no Tom Henderson with a heated barn. There was only Abigail Preston, a former corporate lawyer from Chicago, whose ex-husband had told her she wasn't capable of keeping a houseplant alive, let alone running a farm. A fierce, primal surge of adrenaline flooded Abby's veins. She refused to lose them. Not tonight. "Okay, Tempest, we're doing this together." Abby gritted her teeth. She lubricated her hands and arms with heavy obstetrical gel from her emergency kit. Waiting for the exact moment the mare stopped pushing to draw a breath, Abby reached inside the birth canal. The heat of the mare's interior was a shocking contrast to the freezing air of the hut. Abby felt blindly in the darkness of the womb, her fingers tracing the neck of the foal, searching for the missing leg. The pressure was immense, clamping down on her arm like a hydraulic vice every time Tempest contracted. "Don't push, girl, wait, wait," Abby commanded, tears of exertion freezing on her soot-stained cheeks. She found the knee. It was bent backward. Hooking her fingers around the fragile joint, Abby waited for the next lull. When it came, she shoved the foal backward into the uterus, a terrifying, counterintuitive move that made Tempest groan in agony, just enough to free the trapped shoulder. With a twist of her wrist, she snapped the leg forward into the proper diving position. "Now!" Abby screamed over the roaring wind outside. "Push!" Tempest gave a massive, shuddering heave. Abby grabbed the two slippery, translucent hooves, planted her boots into the rubber matting, and threw her entire body weight backward. With a wet, tearing sound, the foal slid free, landing in a steaming heap on the pine shavings. It was a colt. He was massive, pitch black, and entirely motionless. The amniotic sac was still tightly wrapped over his muzzle. Abby scrambled forward, her hands shaking violently from the adrenaline and the cold. She tore the thick membrane away from his nose and mouth, scooped out the fluid with her fingers, and grabbed a rough burlap towel. She began rubbing his ribcage with frantic, brutal strokes. "Breathe," she sobbed, the cold finally penetrating her thin flannel shirt. "Come on, breathe!" 10 seconds passed. Nothing. Abby balled her fist and struck the foal hard on the ribs, right behind the shoulder. The colt gasped. His chest expanded with a sudden, violent hitch, and he let out a wet, rattling snort. He shook his heavy head, his oversized ears flopping, and blinked against the dim light of the battery-powered lantern. Abby collapsed backward into the shavings, laughing and crying simultaneously, as Tempest nickered weakly, lifting her head to nuzzle her new son. But the battle wasn't over. The temperature inside the hut had fallen to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The colt was soaked in amniotic fluid, and wet hair loses heat incredibly fast. Without the wood stove, hypothermia would take him within the hour. Abby didn't hesitate. She grabbed every dry wool blanket she had, swaddled the shivering foal, and then did the only thing left to do. She crawled under the heavy blankets with him, pulling him tight against her own chest, using her core body heat to act as an incubator. She lay there in the dark, sandwiched between the massive, exhausted bulk of Tempest and the fragile, shivering body of the newborn colt, listening to the apocalyptic roar of the blizzard tearing the rest of her farm to pieces. When dawn broke on December 15th, the silence was absolute. The wind had finally died, leaving behind a world buried in blinding, undisturbed white. Inside the Quonset hut, Abby woke to a rough, wet tongue dragging across her forehead. She blinked open her eyes, her body stiff and aching with a profound, bone-deep chill. Standing over her, wobbly but entirely upright, was the black colt. He was dry, his thick winter coat fluffed up like a bear cub's, and he was aggressively searching for milk. Abby checked the thermometer on the wall. It read 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was frigid, but they had survived. The thick layer of closed-cell polyurethane foam had performed a miracle. It had trapped just enough of the thermal energy given off by Abby and the two horses to keep the ambient temperature above the critical freezing point of the damp shavings. Abby groaned as she stood up, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She walked to the sliding heavy steel door and threw her weight against the latch. It took 3 hard shoves to break the ice seal. When the door finally rolled back, the sunlight reflecting off the snow was blinding. Abby stepped out and gasped. The magnificent 1920s timber barn was gone. In its place was a chaotic, jagged mountain of splintered Douglas fir, torn shingles, and deep snowdrifts. But rising proudly from the center of the wreckage, completely unharmed, was the shiny, corrugated steel spine of the Quonset hut. It looked like a silver submarine that had surfaced through a sea of broken wood. It had taken the full, catastrophic weight of the collapsing roof and hadn't buckled an inch. As Abby stood there, marveling at the sheer survival of her tin can, a low mechanical hum broke the morning silence. Coming across the crest of the snow-buried pasture was a heavy-duty tracked snowmobile. The rider was bundled in thick, neon-orange winter gear, navigating the massive drifts with practiced ease. The machine pulled up to the wreckage of Abby's barn and killed the engine. The rider pulled off his helmet. It was Tom Henderson. His face was drawn, pale, and completely devoid of its usual arrogant smirk. His eyes were wide as he took in the sight, the completely destroyed wooden barn and the pristine steel bunker sitting intact in the middle of it. Then his gaze dropped to the open door, where Tempest stood calmly, munching on some hay, with a healthy, hyperactive black colt darting between her legs. Tom stared, speechless, his breath pluming in the -20 degrees Fahrenheit morning air. "Tom?" Abby asked, stepping forward, her voice hoarse from the smoke and cold. "Are you okay? Did your house make it?" Tom swallowed hard. He looked at the ground, then back up at Abby. The pride that usually puffed up his chest was completely gone. "The house is fine," Tom said, his voice cracking. "But the grid failed at 6 last night." "I know," Abby said. "But you have the 50-kilowatt generator, right?" Tom let out a bitter, self-deprecating laugh. "Diesel gel's at 15 degrees, Abby. I bought the winter blend. I put the anti-gel additives in the tank, but the wind chill hit -60. The fuel lines froze solid at midnight. The generator died." Abby felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Your commercial barn?" "It's a freezer," Tom whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "The wind tore 4 panels off the south wall. The snow blew right into the main aisle. I lost 2 yearlings to the shock this morning. My 2 best pregnant mares, they're shivering so hard they can barely stand. If I don't get them into a draft-free, insulated space in the next hour, I'm going to lose them too. And the foals." He looked at the steel walls of the Quonset hut. He looked at the frost-free breath of the healthy newborn colt. Then, the wealthiest, proudest rancher in Bitterroot Valley took off his heavy leather gloves, dropped them in the snow, and looked Abby in the eyes. "Abby, I was wrong," Tom said, his voice raw with desperation. "I was an arrogant, stupid old man. You built the only structure in this valley that beat the storm. I am begging you. Do you have room in that tin can for 2 more? Abby looked at the man who had turned her into a local joke. She thought of Richard, her ex-husband, who had never once apologized for making her feel small. She had spent her entire life shrinking to accommodate the egos of men who thought they knew better. But out here, In the brutal clarity of the Montana winter, ego meant nothing. Only survival mattered. Abby pulled the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders and gave Tom a firm, unwavering nod. "Go get your mares, Tom," she said, quietly. "We've got room." By noon, Tom and his ranch hands had managed to trailer the two freezing, terrified mares over to Abby's property. When they led the animals into the Quonset hut, the mares immediately relaxed, their violent shivering subsiding in the draft-free, foam-insulated stillness of the bunker. Word spread through Bitterroot Valley faster than the blizzard itself. Over the next 3 days, as the county plows struggled to clear the roads and the utility crews fought to restore the power grid, Abby's farm became the focal point of the community. Hank, the owner of the feed and seed who had mocked her a month prior, drove his personal snowcat up her driveway to deliver a complimentary ton of premium alfalfa and 10 bags of pine shavings. Deputy Wayne, who had scoffed at her permit requests, stopped by to help Tom safely reroute and weld a new chimney pipe for the Vogelzang stove, getting the fire roaring again. Nobody laughed anymore. The men in their Carhartt jackets who had sneered at her submarine now walked through the ruined shell of the timber barn, running their calloused hands over the unyielding corrugated steel of the Quonset hut, asking her quiet, respectful questions about R values, arch load capacities, and the application of closed-cell foam. Abby Preston didn't just survive the storm, she conquered it. She named the Colt bulletproof, and as she stood in the center of her steel sanctuary, watching the community she had tried to hide from now gathered around her in awe, she realized she no longer needed to disappear. She had finally built a foundation strong enough to stand on. They had laughed at the city woman who built a steel submarine inside a rotting wooden barn, mocking her unconventional methods. But when the deadly bomb cyclone hit, shattering the old timber and freezing the valley's state-of-the-art facilities, her ridiculed tin can stood invincible. Abigail Preston didn't just save her horse and a newborn foal, she earned the profound, hard-won respect of an entire mountain town.